Welcome to the Truth of a Comfort Show. Today's guest is Charlie Skelton. He's here to talk about the Bilderberg Group, as he's been covering it since about 2009 for The Guardian. He also provides comedic writings for a variety of TV shows. And I'm very excited to have him here to talk about the infamous Bilderberg Group. So how are you doing today, Charlie?
I'm very well. And how are you?
Good, thank you. So if you just want to tell people, first of all, a bit about yourself and your work, and then we can get onto, your journey into covering the Bilderberg Group, what it actually is, brief history, and of course, the recent meetings, one of which you obviously attended in Lisbon.
Well, I wouldn't say I attended it, but yeah, I've been hovering outside Bilderberg meetings since 2009, when I went along as a kind of, almost as a joke, because I just thought it'd be funny to write about this thing. Because I've come from the world of writing jokes and comedy, and did a bit of journalism, but it tended to be quite light-hearted, and sort of I did like kind of feature writing for Evening Standard and things like that, which was all good fun. And when I went along to the Bilderberg Group for the first time to cover it, it was, in the spirit of it being a kind of an amusing piece of gonzo journalism, or wouldn't it be funny to see what this secret group is up to? Kind of, sort of, it had all been done by John Ronson 10 years earlier when he went along to, I think it was the Lisbon meeting, I think it was 1999. So yeah, and he went along and he, met Jim Tucker, who was a guy covering it at the time. And so he wrote about his exploits there, and that was interesting. And so I kind of was doing the same thing, really. But then it was such an extraordinary experience doing it that it lured me in, and now I've been sort of trying to write more seriously about it ever since. And still doing it, and still writing stuff mainly for The Guardian, but I've written some stuff for things like, I did a long read for The Independent, and I've written for Transparency International a couple of times, a couple of kind of scolding articles about the kind of opaque nature of the meeting, and about how it's jam-packed with lobbyists and that kind of thing. So when I tend to write about it, it's usually about lobbying and the kind of lack of transparency and also the lack of coverage. So yeah, for me, it's just, I think it's, important's the wrong word, but it's at least something to get some coverage out into the mainstream media about this meeting, which seems to me to be quite important.
Yeah, so just before we go on, do you just want to tell people what the Bilderberg Group actually is? Not everyone's familiar with it, or they've sort of just heard it, in brief mentioning. So, what is the Bilderberg Group, and just, a brief history of itself and its founding?
Well, it's a tricky question, obviously, but at one level, and at the kind of simplest level, it's a group of about 30 odd people on a governing body that organise a yearly conference, which takes place usually around May or June, end of May, beginning of June, and it's a 3-day event. And they invite along politicians, very senior politicians. So it's like prime ministers and foreign ministers and defense ministers and economic ministers, senior intelligence officials, often from America, but also from Europe, and CEOs and chairmen of big businesses and corporations, and they all get together and they discuss the topics of the day. And those are things, whether it could be foreign policy, it could be economic policy, or more and more it's technology and AI. Yes, they've been doing that in more or less the same format since the mid-50s. So they started getting together in the early 50s, and then they had their first conference in 1954. And Henry Kissinger first went in 1957, and he's still going today. So, which is remarkable. And we got some nice photos of Henry. That was a week before his 100th birthday, and he's still sticking his oar into the world of foreign policy and kind of geopolitical strategy and big thinking. And so yeah, they like to engage in big thoughts and big thinking. They often have academics to come along and give some expert opinion on these issues. And yeah, so that's broadly speaking the thing that takes place. And then back in the 70s, they used to hold press conferences, and you can still see some of those on YouTube. And they don't hold them anymore. I keep petitioning them to hold a press conference or make a press statement at least afterwards, but as yet they don't.
If I'm correct, it started in Holland at the Hotel Bilderberg, which is where it got its name from. And, it's always had attendees in royalty. Prince Bernhard of the Netherlands was, I think, one of the founders, or at least, attended the first meetings. And then he sort of passed that on to Queen Beatrice of the Netherlands. And, if you look at participants over the years, you'll see like the King of Spain. I think even the meeting, the first one after COVID, included the King of Holland. So, royalty's always been there, as you said, high politicians, people of business, lobbyists, intelligence, heads of CIA, MI6, heads of the military, national security state, which we can get to now. But the first time she went was kind of, it was a bit of a joke. So what led you to, how did you find out about it? What were your preconceptions of it at that time? And how did the time you went in Greece, how did that shape your future view of it?
Well, I had an inkling of it. It had a kind of reputation which it still has, as this kind of shadowy group of strategists and kind of new world order shapers and puppet masters, that sort of a thing. So I had a vague sense that was sort of what. Bear in mind, it was extremely vague what I thought about it, and as I said, I probably had read what John Ronson had written about it, but yeah, so I just had a sort of sense of it more than anything, and there was no information about it whatsoever. So when I went to Greece, to Vouliagmeni, where it was, there was only one mention of where it might be in one online forum. So there was just this like discussion group online where they went, "Oh, I think it might be here," and then someone went, "Yeah, no, I think it might be," and it was like literally that was it. So, and I just on the back of it booked a ticket and went, and I just turned up in this place and had no inkling really of what there was there at all, and then started seeing the limousines and the machine guns and got, oh, okay, so this seems to be a thing taking place. And then it went very weird because there were so few people there were a few alternative journalists, but really like a handful, and me writing that had been commissioned by the Guardian to write the thing. And from the next day when I woke up, I just suddenly realized I was being followed, and it was really creepy. I just went, "I've got these two guys are just following me around," and then it got weirder and weirder. Like there were more and more people following me, and it kind of makes you feel kind of strange. There's just these two burly guys always behind you. Then when I went up towards the venue to take photos, I started getting stopped by the police and then just sort of detained and put in a police car and taken to the police station. And I really was just there to write a jokey piece, and then suddenly I found myself, and literally I remember at one point I took a photograph of a limousine's wheels because I thought that would look cool, right? And that was way too much for the police, and they sort of screamed up in their cars, took me off, and then stood round me in the police station shouting, a ring of them shouting, "Give me your camera, give me your camera." And I just went, "No, well, I'm not going to see how this plays out." And anyway, it got so intense that I left the area. I gave up, right? It was too freaky. I just got in a cab. I got arrested whilst trying to get into a cab. to leave. And I was going, look, believe me, I'm literally trying to leave this place. Let me go. Got in a cab to Athens, which was the big city nearby, and got out of the cab with all my stuff. And there were 2 motorbikes pulled up behind me with 2 guys on it, and started following me again in Athens. This is like 25 kilometers away. So at that point, it all went nuts. And I wrote about this at length because I was sort of blogging about it really for The Guardian at the time. And it got to the point where I absolutely unironically I didn't know who these people were. I unironically jumped into a cab and said, take me to the embassy. Got to the British embassy in Athens, which was shut for the weekend, and had to just have a conversation through an intercom. I had a vague idea that I'd be taken in and given a cup of tea and said, don't worry, you're on English soil now, don't worry, British soil. And nothing like that happened. So I was just kind of on my own. At one point, there must have been 10 people following me around Athens. And another point, anyway, blah, blah. It got, sorry, I don't want to get too bogged down into that madness, but it was insane. And I think it was so intense and so nuts that it made me take it seriously. They should just have let me take some photos of some limousine wheels, and I'd probably never have done it again. I'd gone, oh, well, that was interesting. But as it was, I was like, what on earth is going on? Why are they so paranoid? What? And who are these people? I didn't even know. It turned out that they were diplomatic police. But it took me about a week to find out even who was following me. Anyway, so that happened, and then I've been going more or less every year since. So they stopped for a couple of years due to COVID, and then they started again in Washington last year, which I did miss because basically almost everyone missed last year. It was so tightly, the information about it was so tightly held back, and luckily a couple of people, Josh Friedman went and Luke Radowski turned up as well. So it was at least there was someone on the ground. But I mean, that it was very sparsely covered. I managed to write a piece for The Guardian again remotely. And then this year I went to Lisbon and was on the ground taking photos and writing. And so, still at it. So I'm looking forward to next year.
Yeah, I went back and actually read, I think you called it the Bilderberg, your series, and I went back and read the one in 2009 where you went to Greece, and in the article you talk about how you eventually went to the police station to talk to the Greek police, and they all just said, no, we don't know who they are. Showed them a picture, like, we don't know them, we don't know them, we don't know them. And then you asked to go to the toilet or just get a coffee or something, and then you saw one of the guys there, and you shouted at the police like, that's him, that's him. And the guy ran off, and all the police were still kind of trying to deny it, and gave you a sheet to fill out and all of that. So yeah, it was interesting to read. I recommend people to read it. But you're probably right. If you went there and they let you just take photos, you go, well, this is quite a monumental event, but you ended up getting chased by police, and you can't even take a photo of a limousine wheel, the least controversial kind of thing ever.
It was my first kind of interaction as well with what I suppose you call the conspiracy community, because there is obviously an overlap between, Bilderberg gets written about by, for the most part, by historians of post-war kind of transatlantic intelligence and geopolitics. It does get written about academically, but also the conspiracy community, whatever you call them, have been interested in it for a while. And so that was really my first interaction with that crowd. So whilst I was in Greece, I was on the phone doing a live interview with Alex Jones at the time, whilst being followed by just some guys along the street. And so he was there. It was the most mind-bending experience of me, with being on the phone to this guy going, oh, you've fallen down the rabbit hole now. And me turning around and seeing some guys follow me up an alley kind of thing. And I'm just going, what on earth is going on? This is crazy. So yeah, that all happened at once for me, at that time. And yeah.
Yeah, that was a pretty good impression there of Alex Jones. I think I actually saw it on YouTube, but I didn't watch it. But I saw there was some videos of you speaking to him back then, so they may have been the one. I'll put that in the show notes if anyone's interested in that. You know, obviously, it probably was more secretive, during the Cold War because there wasn't, the internet and much media attention. So obviously now they actually have a website where they publish the agendas and the participants who actually attend the meetings, which I think only came out in, the last decade or so. So, obviously there's been kind of a shift, it seems, in some of their agendas and the attendees focusing more on big tech and AI. So, over the decade, how have you seen some of the participants or the steering committee or agendas change over the last, basically since you first covered it?
Yeah, I definitely the shift into tech is the big shift that I've seen. So it started off, I think it was Craig Mundy, he was like very high up in Microsoft. I think he was like I can't remember his exact title. It's like chief advisor to the CEO or to Bill Gates or whatever. So he was right at the top of Microsoft, and he was the first kind of Silicon Valley guy to join. And he and so following him there was like Peter Thiel, who was so he's PayPal and then an early investor in Facebook, and he was on the board of Facebook until not that long ago. And then you have Eric Schmidt, who ran Google and then Alphabet, and he and Peter Thiel are still on the board. Craig Mundy has just literally now, about a week ago, resigned from the steering committee and been replaced by the current CEO of Microsoft, Nadella. So Microsoft still even more powerfully in the midst of things there. So yeah, you've got these big tech guys on this steering committee of what you would think was a kind of old school group of old manufacturing interests and big oil, and it's got it, as you say, it's got this long history with Dutch royalty. So obviously, and that all ties in with Royal Dutch Shell and BP, and they're all so the oil interests are very long-standing there. So it's got this kind of old history, but it's also reinvented itself, I think, quite successfully. I mean, very successfully, to the point where big cutting-edge tech conversations are taking place there. So Sam Altman, who's been a few times, I met him in the street walking along with Peter Thiel in I think it was 2016 in Dresden, and he's been a few times. He came this year to Lisbon, and he'd just been testifying, I think, to Congress or to some American body about the regulation of, or potential regulation of AI. And then that conversation, when he left Bilderberg, he tweeted about the fact he'd been having conversations in Europe about AI regulation. And so that's really interesting because he's having those conversations with the CEO of Microsoft and with big AI types like Alex Karp of Palantir and Demis Hassabis from DeepMind, which is owned by Google, and obviously Eric Schmidt as well. And so they're having those conversations about AI regulation at Bilderberg with some big European, particularly regulators. 2 European commissioners were there, EU commissioners, and then a variety of European politicians and policymakers. So it's interesting to see that Bilderberg still housing cutting-edge conversations, even though you could glance at it and think it was a bit passé, but it's definitely not. It's right at the cutting edge of tech and also foreign policy, the way the people there, and intelligence. So the conversations that are taking place about Ukraine and Russia are taking place, with like the Ukrainian foreign minister was there this year, and so it's like it's plugged in, unbelievably well plugged in to policy and geopolitical strategy and the transatlantic alliance, and obviously NATO as well, I should say, because Stoltenberg, who's currently still the Secretary General of NATO, has been multiple times. I was in Turin at one conference, and you could see him giving a keynote. We literally had a view across the rooftops to him giving a keynote address to the kind of assembled attendees about NATO. And then in 2019, we had Pompeo, the Secretary of State, US Secretary, turn up, and it was just nuts. It was that was a nuts moment of being up. We managed to get up onto a balcony looking down at this extraordinary motorcade turn up, and just so heavily armed. And then before this crazy car pulled up in front of the hotel, where he was lurking inside, but before even anyone got out, this armored car behind the car, the doors came out the back, and this massive machine gun just pointed up at our balcony like this, just literally just a group of like sort of 5 or 6 journalists. We just sort of in the crosshairs of a machine gun, and then he got out and shook his hands, and then went and joined the conference. So so they're still attracting big names, and still they're still plugged in, and it's when it used to get talked about a little bit and written off as a kind of talking shop, or it's like some old guy. The line that dismissed it was always, it's just some old guys playing golf. And I don't think that washes anymore. I just don't think you can reasonably look at the attendee list and go, oh, it's just some has-beens playing a game of golf before their retirement or after their retirement. It just doesn't. That isn't really how it functions.
Yeah, you made a really good point in your interview with Jason Bermas on not the most recent Bilderberg, the one before in Washington, where you talk about the Dutch Prime Minister, the Finnish Prime Minister, the NATO Secretary General, the CIA head, ex-MI6, GCHQ, all these people and from all these corporations are willing to take out 3 to 4 days out of their schedule. Then we should take it serious. Think about how busy these people are, and how precious their time is. Always, obviously, private jetting around to save time and things like that. They're willing to, take literally 3 days out of their schedule, all at the same time. With about 100 and something participants. Then we should be taking it serious because they are.
Totally. I mean, Stoltenberg is there for 3 nights. He's there. He turns up on Thursday and leaves on like Sunday, and that he keeps talking about all the Vilnius NATO summit. It's all he talks about at the moment, which is taking place in July. That's one night. That's the main NATO conference, and he stays there, the summit, and he stays there for one night. He's at Bilderberg for 3 nights in the middle of a war. You have to ask yourself, why is that so useful? Oh, by the way, useful is an interesting word. The number of people that have talked about being at Bilderberg and finding it useful, it's quite a key word from politicians. It was a very useful conference. It was very useful. But he obviously finds it useful because he comes year after year, and it's a big outing. It's a big NATO outing. As I mentioned, and did I mention the Guardian piece? I don't know, but he went jogging in the morning, and with his security, such a large security team that it looked like the start of a charity marathon. It was just like, he turns up with a lot of staff and a lot of security. And it's very interesting to see the big politicians turn up with a lot of aides and staff. The Canadians were there in force this year with Chrystia Freeland, the Deputy Prime Minister. But, she had brought aides. She was at the airport with the Canadian ambassador to Portugal. So it's a big diplomatic meeting for a lot of these people. And there are meetings diplomatic meetings that take place around it, and kind of in the kind of around the edges of this conference, which are every bit as important as the conference itself.
Yeah, no, I've seen other times where like the G7 or NATO meetings sort of all happen at the same time. End up being a huge weekend, and these people are going back and forth to the different ones. But yeah, since you brought up this focus just on the last two meetings, it's been very heavy in the agenda. I'll put up on the screen, on Ukraine, Russia, China, the Indo-Pacific, competition with China and technology, and the amount of intelligence people they had and people from the military in the last two meetings. It's seriously heavy. I mean, you have the CIA director William Burns there. You have either the current or ex-head of GCHQ, which is like a British version of the NSA. You have John Sawyers, who's on the steering committee, who's on the board of BP, ex-head of MI6. You have in the one post-COVID, you had like Jake Sullivan, all these National Security Council people and advisors. Just how heavy have the last two been on that, and all these different people swimming, obviously, with politicians and the rest.
Very heavy, and it's not like these people shouldn't meet. It's like they've got a war to run, etc. But what's uncomfortable about it for me is particularly, and this is particularly clear to be uncomfortable about this and reasonable, which is that there's so many investors there. I mean, literally just shark-like Wall Street investors, billionaire private equity bosses, and people like Henry Kravis, who goes every year, and this year Kenneth Griffin from Citadel, which is huge. He's like the world's 28th whatever richest man, or some crazy thing like that. Big billionaire. And what is he doing at these talks? Why is he there at all? What on earth is it that allows this lock-in with these people who all they're interested in is turning a buck, and making some money? So what on earth, when they're getting this competitive advantage, and they got their whole professional everything they do is geared towards staying ahead and having the information ahead of their competitor, and this is them being plugged into diplomacy and politics at the very edge of decision making. So it's really hard to justify their presence, and you go down the list and you see there's investor after investor after investor, and I don't get why they should be there at these things, which you would argue that there's a public interest to have these conversations. Okay, fine. Diplomacy happens away from the press, but I don't see once Kenneth Griffin and Henry Kravis are there, I don't see why there isn't a press conference, because I don't see why. In fact, I don't see why there at all. It seems insane. And just also, sorry, on the subject of inappropriate attendees, the number of very, very senior lobbyists who are there, as I mentioned, these are people that are the chairman and vice president and board members of global lobbying organizations. The guy, I looked up the CEO of the chemical giant BASF, and he's on just big lobbying, Internet European Chemical Association or whatever, stuff like that. And then all they are just industry. Well, they're not all they are, but one of the things they are is extremely high up industry lobbyists, and they're part of this cozy lock-in. So yeah, it's things like that which remain for me extremely uncomfortable and also easy to critique.
Yeah, so can you talk about some of the firms that are represented by CEOs, chiefs, and boards, or organisations like the EU, who's obviously heavily represented this year? So who were some of the big company and corporation or governmental names that caught your eye this year?
Well, there was a lot of oil there. So you had the chair and CEO of Total, and there's a board member of Total also on the board of Bilderberg. As you mentioned, John Sawyers, a board member of BP. BP sent their CEO as well. Then we had the former CEO of Shell there, Ben van Beurden, have you said? And he's still plugged into Shell. I think he's like the senior advisor to the CEO, to the board or something like that. And then you had what was interesting, you look down the list, John Sawyers isn't listed as director of BP, even though that's probably his main thing. He's listed as chairman of Newbridge Advisory, which is ridiculous. That's just his private company that he runs, with his wife at home, where she does his accounts in. That's not anything. It's not what he is, but that's what they put him down as. Likewise, you've got Baroness Moyo, who's just down as a sort of member of the House of Lords, but she's on the board of Chevron. Might be better if you were being a little bit more transparent to list her as a director of Chevron. So at least you could, when you looked at the list, you go, oh, I see why she's there. But that applies to lots of the list. I mean, even people like, if you want to get really train spotty, you can look down the list and see someone like Shadlow. So she's Nadia Shadlow. She's down as a kind of academic. She's down as a senior fellow of the Hudson Institute. But she's lots of other things. She's also on the International Advisory Board of Banco Santander, which is the big Spanish bank, which is represented on the Bilderberg Steering Committee by its chairman. So there's lots of big banking interests. AXA, the French financial giant, is heavily represented this year. And as I said, BASF. So there's Pfizer, the CEO of Pfizer was there again. He was there last year. So lots of big business, and a lot of politicians, European politicians this year. Not from the US, it was kind of the security establishment and intelligence officials, but very high up ones, like the Director of National Intelligence. But yeah, this year from Europe, it was a lot of politicians. 3 prime ministers, I think, and lots of former prime ministers and lots of ministers, etc., etc. And the vice president of the European Parliament, etc., 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 etc. But it's worth, if you haven't had a look down the list, it's worth just having a look and just picking someone and then seeing, oh, what else do they do, and cross-referring. And only by doing that do you get a sense of the kind of rich interdependence of this sort of, one might almost say the military-industrial complex.
Yeah, that's the thing when you look at these people, they're always on like so many different boards. Like I wasn't even aware that Henry Kissinger is on the board of Deutsche Bank. Like I couldn't believe that he's still actually on a board. Is he not?
He can't be on the board of Deutsche Bank. I'm sorry, that is not.
No, maybe I got wrong. I thought you tweeted about Deutsche Bank. I could be wrong about that. I swear I looked earlier. Henry Kissinger, Deutsche Bank.
Well, I tell you what I will say about Henry Kissinger is remember a few years ago, I was just decided to kind of go through and look at some of the links and the board memberships and the trusteeships and the advisory groups that the kind of Bilderberg insiders have. And he had by far the most, like just to a crazy degree, the most number of directorships and memberships of various bodies. He's still unbelievably connected. The Deutsche Bank guy in Bilderberg is Achleitner, and he's just left the board actually. So there's a gap. There's currently a gap on the board for a German. So watch this space. And if I had to guess, that BASF guy looks. He might be being groomed. We'll see. But yeah, there's a German gap on the board of Bilderberg currently.
Yes, so I'm just on Deutsche Bank's Global Advisory Board. I think it's maybe from 2022 November, and it says Henry Kissinger and Eric Schmidt are both on it. Oh, really? I can send you this after. I'm sure I saw this on your Twitter.
Yes, right. Yeah, you're right. I did tweet that, and it is. Yeah, but that's an advice. Yeah, so it's not the direction of the actual bank, but you're dead right. He's I'd forgotten. God, yeah, he's on that board as well. So yeah, he's still plugged in.
Yeah, no, I thought I saw it on your Twitter, and then you made me wonder. But yeah, so just to give people an idea, obviously you spoke about your first time going in Greece, but like, how heavy is the security, the police, and how much of it's blocked off? Obviously, again, you spoke about Greece and the crazy chases there, but like just how heavy is it? Can you get anywhere near the building? You know, how do they book the whole hotel off so no one else can even stay there? How does it work?
Yeah, I mean, there's lots of layers of security. So it's, you know, at the perimeter, it's handled by local police, you know, so whatever the city police are. So it's traffic police from Lisbon were a lot of those, but then there's always like more police around them, and then you see there's a lot of very senior police there. So you're always doing a little tour, you know, so everyone, you know, saluting to them. And then you have a lot of plainclothes police coming in and out, lots of police cars, sort of with just like some guys in. Then everyone has their security team. There's a lot of people have even private security, so there's a lot of bodyguards around. The bodyguards that were attached to Alex Karp at Palantir were noticeable, mainly because they were so vast. These guys. I spoke to one of them, this huge guy called Ryan, and shook his hand and pressed a sort of note into his hand to give to his bosses, saying, can I interview you, please, Mr. Karp and Mr. Teal. So they have there's private security. Then there's diplomatic security, because there's, you know, there was no royalty there this year, but there was a lot of, you know, prime ministers and you know, senior intelligence people. They all have their security. There's military security for like the Supreme Allied Commander. You could see the military bodyguards there. So you've got, it's just this massive security operation with lots of interlocking security teams, and then you'll have people come in with, you know, motorbike flanked by motorcyclists, you know, police motorbikes, and also, you know, cars, you know, in front and behind, so that someone will bring in a prime minister or whoever it is, and that will come in as a kind of motorcade. None of them as big as Pompeo's motorcade this year, but still impressive. There's a thing thunders past, and so yeah, it's very well guarded, you know, and there's a lot of security just hanging around inside. I mean, you couldn't, like, it's not like it's completely impregnable. Not that anyone's trying to impregnate it. Not that anyone's trying to get inside. Really, we're just trying to take some photos, you know, and try and cover it at all. But yeah, so it's always interesting to see the security, to see the operation. It's a big operation. I mean, it comes in just as a conference. It's a big deal, you know. Where they bring in, like, you know, lorry loads of equipment just to run as a conference. So yeah, it's a massive operation. It takes a team. There's a big team of people that literally just run the thing as an event. So it's, you know, so it's all of that. Then there's the hotel side of things. It's a big, you know, for the hotel, they're having to host all of these people for, you know, 4 days or whatever. So it's a big deal for them. They're all, like, you know, nervous and well, you know, and running between checkpoints, and there's checkpoints everywhere and blah blah blah. So yeah, it's an impressive thing to witness, and, you know, I guess all we can do is kind of bear witness to it.
Yeah, I'll start winding it down because I know you said a half hour. We've gone over that. So just, you know, last couple of questions. So what do you make of the fact that, you know, there's clearly just very little media interest or coverage? You know, when I checked, you know, the internet for when the meeting happened, the first one after COVID in 2022, yours was the only article in a mainstream press in the Guardian, because obviously you cover it every year, if you could even count that. But like, I, you know, scrolled a few pages, there wasn't a single other mainstream media outlet that actually covered it. So this interest of the media, and do they have any presence at the meetings? And, you know, over the last decade, did they have some, and now it's just, again, kind of fizzled out?
Well, the meeting itself is heavily integrated with the Economist and the Financial Times. And if you look back at the older reports from the meetings, you can see at the bottom, you know, the rapporteurs are usually from either the Economist or the Financial Times. And in fact, sometimes those rapporteurs graduate into the conference proper, like Gideon Rachman, who went this year. He's from the Financial Times, so he's a senior Financial Times journalist and commentator. And they always used to have Martin Wolf, but Rachman's been, I think, a couple of times. And so there's quite a few inside. If you look inside, there are quite a few commentators inside, and you'll get, and some of them will then write their kind of, you know, carefully Chatham Housed piece, not mentioning names, but sort of just get a vague sense of some of the issues that had come out and some of the positions that had been developed and talked about. But none of them are reporting on it, obviously. And there are obviously some big media owners in there. You know, there's some big media houses which are represented at the, you know, whether it's Axel Springer or Warner, or, you know, there's lots of different media interests inside. But yeah, as you say, last year was terrible. It was like nothing. It was tumbleweed. And then this year's slightly better. You know, I think the Daily Mail may have done a right around of the list, and there's a couple of different things that popped up, but, you know, not a great deal. And you know, it is slightly a mystery that this thing which is clearly there happening isn't talked about. But I think my position on it, broadly speaking, is that it's less because someone is going, don't talk about the Bilderberg group. You know, it's more they just don't talk about it, and they've got out of the habit of it. And journalists, there are fewer and fewer journalists working in newsrooms. Everyone's overstretched. Everyone's being replaced by AI. But there's, you know what I mean? There's just no one. There's just fewer humans doing this job. They're all overstretched. All they do is write up press releases. And if your event isn't open to the press and giving and handing over bump and blurb and photos and little clips that you can use, then if that doesn't happen, nothing happens. Because the amount of actual journalism of getting stuff and having to, you know, fight uphill a little bit to get the stuff, and to you know, to have to ask questions and to do a bit of digging, no one does that, really. I mean, it happens. You do get that sort of journalism still happens, but it's, again, that's more. It's more in the fringes of the mainstream. Like on some of the larger online magazines will do interesting deep dives into things, but it's been a while since anyone dived deeply into Bilderberg, and certainly the mainstream news media just seem to find it an impossibility to write about. They just can't do it to a large degree. You know, hats off to the Daily Mail for actually just simply reporting on the participant list. You know, that's, you know, frankly, if everyone just did a bit more of that, I'd be quite happy.
It's just be more familiar. So there's some house rules where basically you're not allowed to say what someone said at the meeting. So there's nothing really to report on because no one really ever says anything about it. And as you said, they do actually have from media people who actually attend. And I think that maybe some on their steering committee, as you said, The Economist and the Financial Times has been there the last 2 years. And some of them are like their defense editors and stuff like that, which is, you know, as the Ukraine war's going on. But, you know, just for sort of the last also, you know, what do you actually make of the influence of the group? I mean, again, I'm probably in the line of thinking they don't dictate policy or, you know, tell people what to do, but they can, you know, massively influence it and the conversation. You know, do we have any evidence, admissions or whistleblowers of real world events that, you know, kind of came from the Bilderberg meetings?
Well, certainly some of the big kind of trends in post-war history are tied up with some of the big policymakers who've been at the heart of Bilderberg. But do you know what? I tell you, I'm just going to give one little example, which is not even a good example, but it's a thing I tweeted about last year's meeting, and this is pure speculation, right? It was just that I just noticed that a lot of the people involved in from the transatlantic side of the Nord Stream stuff from the intelligence agencies happened to be at the meeting in Washington, and then literally like 2 days later, the mines were were laid. I think it was, according to that Seymour Hersh piece or whatever it was. So anyway, I'm not saying that's where the decision to go live with the Nord Stream sabotage mission was made, but it might have been. So that's you get that kind of, you can really do some, that is pure tinfoil speculation, if you will. But you know, there's because a lot of these things are intangible, and because they are broad policy moves and, you know, and regulatory moves, like the AI conversation that was taking place between Sam Altman and the EU commissioners. It's hard to get exactly a handle on it, but, you know, because a lot of these things are political public interest conversations, it's a shame there isn't more press oversight and press coverage, you know. But, you know, I'm banging the same old drum there. I'm boring myself.
Yeah, I mean, the lack of media coverage, the fact, like, they have a website, but all they put out is literally like AI, Ukraine, China, you know, and what manner was it spoken about, you know, what actually was. And, you know, they say they're not in an official capacity, but as you tweeted for last year, you had Jens Stoltenberg literally tweet out he was talking to the Finland Prime Minister at Bilderberg about joining NATO in secret. But he actually tweeted about it, so we know about it. But yeah, there's complete radio silence, you know.
That's actually a conversation. That conversation about whether people are there officially is an ongoing conversation. I had a live face-to-face conversation at the hotel before the conference with their media representative of the group, who have just by dint of covering this have got to vaguely not know, but be able to have a conversation with. And that is one of the big disagreements, I think, between the position they're still holding about themselves and the position that I certainly and many others would have about it, about whether you can say that the people that attend this meeting and this conference are doing so as individuals or as officials, you know, in their official capacity as whatever it is, minister of this or commissioner of that. I think it's ludicrous to say that they're there as individuals, and also actually just simply wrong. I remember, this was in San Moritz, in whenever it was, I can't remember, 2011, whatever. George Osborne, who was then Chancellor of the Exchequer, attended, and I rang up the Treasury and I just asked their press office, in what capacity, simple question, in what capacity is George Osborne attending this meeting? And it took the whole day to get an answer, but it was, he's attending as Chancellor of the Exchequer. You know, he was there as the government minister. So, you know, that's just that is just the case, and you can see it's the case, and it's impossible that it's not the case. And I think it's a quibble that they're still holding to suggest that somehow there's some kind of special magic that strips everyone of their office when they sit down in that classroom and start discussing China and Ukraine and AI, which makes them just people, as if they're suddenly naked sitting there. And I just think that's nonsense. And I'm slightly embarrassed on their part that they're holding to that line, because I think it's not a line they can hold to, but I think they have to hold on to it, because if they don't hold that line, then the other line that they hold, which is that they don't hold a press conference, gets harder and harder to to stick to and harder to justify. And if they ever let that fall, that sort of that bit of their kind of wall, if that brick of their wall falls, that people are there officially and having official diplomatic and political conversations as the officials that they are, then it just seems an impossibility not to have the press involved. I would like to think, anyway.
Yeah. And yeah, just to remind people, it is a meeting between North America and Europe. So when they talk about China, people from China aren't there. When they talk about the global economy, well, they're speaking about the global economy as the West. People always talk about how, the G7 sees themselves as the international community. When they say the international community, condemns Russia, they're talking about the whole world, but it's just the whole world sees it as them. But again, if you just want to give your closing thoughts on this, why we should take it serious, and then just tell people where they can find you. Again, I'll put it in the show notes and put it on the screen. But yeah, just your closing thoughts and where people can find your work.
Oh, my thoughts are it's worth looking into Bilderberg. There's loads of really interesting stuff written about it. You can find most of the conference reports online. So if you just look up, I don't know whatever you want to look up. Maybe you want to look up a conference that Klaus Schwab attended. You can find out when that was, whether it was 1995, whatever it is. You can then for the most part, read the kind of report that was produced by the conference itself and then distributed to the various members and participants. That's always worth reading. It's worth looking at some of the names that passed through the doors of the group and just having a bit of a dig. And then if you were to look at the last few years, just have a look at some of the names and just have a look at some of the board memberships and the positions that people hold, and then start questioning what they're doing there and how it's justified. And yeah, you don't even really have to do much speculation to find it troublesome. But and then you can find my stuff by just searching my name and looking on the Guardian. But I've also written some other stuff for like Transparency International. That's more about lobbying. But that's also a good place to start. Just the whole looking at it through the prism of lobbying is a good way to look at it. And and then there's some people tweeting about it. So there were the people that went along. It's always worth following. So this year, I think we had Dan Dix that was there, Josh Friedman, and I think you may have gone. I know you're back. So I've tweeted links to most of their stuff on my Twitter, which is Deyuk, DEYOOK. Just start digging.
Yeah, no, I completely agree there. And, check out people who previously attended. You can find a clip of Luke Rudkowski talking to Tony Blair, where he says, it was a great meeting. He went there in the 90s. I think David Cameron went there. There was obviously the controversy about Obama and Hillary Clinton. That's a whole nother segue there. So I'll put that in the show notes. But yeah, I'd like to thank you for coming on. Again, I will put all your work in the show notes. Go on.
I know you're wrapping up. I just want to say on the Rudkowski Blair conversation, he had previously lied to Parliament about attending. So that's a really interesting conversation. That was Luke getting a scoop because he then admitted to going, having, I think, in a written answer to Parliament, denied going. So, that's an interesting bit of journalism that took place there. But anyway, yeah, thank you very much for the chat.
I'll dig that up about Tony Blair, the clip, and I'll see if I can find the bit about him lying about in Parliament, because I remember that as well. But yeah, again, thank you for coming on, and I hope you have a nice rest of the day.
Thank you.